All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cesar Cuauhtemoc Garcia Hernandez, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to Tracking ICE Surveillance, the second event of a new series at Ohio State University called Charlas on Migration. I'm a professor at the Ohio State University College of Law, where I hold the Gregory Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And it is my immense pleasure to get to host the Charlas on Migration. Today, I have the honor of welcoming Jacinta Gonzalez, Senior Campaign Organizer at Mi Gente, and Nina Wang, a policy associate with the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. Later this hour, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of them. And to do that, please use the Q&A function that should appear at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Today's conversation is the second of 3 charlas on migration scheduled for this semester. On December 7th, I will host the final talk of the semester, chronicling Arizona's immigration politics, a conversation with Jude Jaffe Block and Terry Green Sterling, the authors of a new book about Joe Arpaio, the well-known former sheriff in Arizona. And like today's event, that event on December 7th will also be free. It'll be open to the public and it will be accessible virtually, but you are required to register. So I will share the registration page information through the chat feature in a few moments. Please feel free to share that registration information with others who might be interested. Today, we turn to immigration surveillance technologies. When the federal government first began regulating who could enter the United States and who could not, it started by targeting Chinese women on the suspicion that they were coming here to engage in prostitution. A few years later, it added some Chinese men coming here to work, though other Chinese men were still allowed. This is a period in the late 19th century that I'm talking about. And to figure out who fit into a barred category and who did not, government officials started asking questions and they began gathering information. They began collecting photographs of new arrivals, adding those to government files. They issued certificates of registration, which could be stored and could be referenced. In short, the creation of federal immigration law led to the enforcement of immigration law, and with that came surveillance. Since the birth of federal immigration law in that period of the late 19th century, immigration law enforcement has turned on information gathering and data analysis. At times crude and analog, the modern version is fast, it is sophisticated, and it is remarkably massive. It is also opaque. Trying to make sense of what the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency knows and how it knows it and what it does with that information reminds me of the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, and whose so-called, what he referred to as his third law, which he initially proposed back in 1973 in a version of an essay titled Profiles of the Future. He described his third law as any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Clarke wrote in that characteristic mix of outlandishness at the time that quite often proved prescient years later. Well, to help us develop a better sense of where the technology ends and the magic begins, or perhaps the other way around, I am excited to be joined by Jacinta Gonzalez and Nina Wang. I'll begin by posing a few questions to each of them this hour. And while we talk, let me again invite you to think about your questions, type those questions into the Q&A feature, which I will be monitoring and from which I will be drawing on to pose questions to Jacinta and Nina. But Jacinta, let me start the conversation by turning to you. So about 3 years ago, Mi Gente, the organization where that you're a part of, and a couple of partners issued a report titled "Who's Behind ICE?" detailing ICE's reliance on tech companies to boost its enforcement capabilities. Amazon is certainly the most famous of those companies that were described in that Who's Behind ICE report. But the report's authors devoted a lot of energy to a much less known company whose name comes straight out of the land of make-believe, Palantir. Lord of the Rings fans who are watching today might remember a version of the Palantiri, the 7 spherical stones that appear in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. In those books, the stones give the user the power to see everything, anywhere, at any time. Palantir, the real company, was named after Palantiri, the fictional stones from the Tolkien books. When it comes to surveillance, Jacinta, how close to the power of the fictional stones does the real company allow the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency to get?
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, Cesar, and really excited to be part of this conversation. You know, just to give folks a little bit of background, because I think when folks hear about surveillance and technology, we kind of get overwhelmed or kind of feel like people have to be specialists in this. From Mi Gente's perspective, as a movement organization, as a group that has been fighting deportations for a very long time, we kind of came across this because the technology was being used against our communities. And that kind of forced us to try to, like you said, peel away and understand what was happening, because people were asking us, like, you know, ICE came to my door. How did they know my address? How did they know who my cousin was? How did they know what car I was driving? And we actually couldn't answer those questions. So that's why we did this research to come out with the report, Who's Behind ICE, that people can check out on our website, notechforice.com. But what we started to uncover is that since its formation, since the Department of Homeland Security was formed, since ICE was formed after 9/11, what we really started to see is that there was this kind of rationale of not only creating a policing agency to police migration, but also to create an international surveillance and spying agency. And so with that, ICE began to not only have the mission of being able to identify, surveil, detain, and deport every undocumented person in the US, but they had to do it with different, other force multipliers, other partners. And so for a long time, that looked like local police forces. But over time, we started to see more and more that they were also working with private companies that were helping expand its powers of surveillance. So in the Who's Behind ICE report, we kind of detail the way that ICE uses data brokers, right? So these private companies that buy and sell data on a mass scale. Globally, data is worth more than oil. It's worth more than gold, right? This is a huge force in the economy. And now policing agencies are starting to use it more and more as well. And that includes ICE. But when you have more data, you also have to analyze that data. And that's where companies like Palantir come in, and they create, Palantir basically custom made software for ICE to be able to process data, to create files on immigrants, to not only help deport them, but also to criminalize them and try to put criminal charges against them. And then when you have all of that data, you have to store it. And that's where companies like Amazon have come in, right? And understood that they can get very, very lucrative contracts providing cloud storage services to the government. And they've invested a lot of money in lobbying in DC to make sure that they get those contracts. And the fourth category that we sort of understood in terms of like private companies that are working with ICE are companies that are tracking biometrics or geolocation tracking, right? So for example, there's a huge industry of trying to create databases on people, on immigrants' biometrics to be able to track their movement, not only in the US, but across the world, right, as they're trying to reach different borders. And we also understand that private prison companies are starting to expand, not to just be thinking about brick and mortar prisons, but also be thinking about using tracking devices, geolocation to be able to monitor people. And we've seen a huge expansion of that, particularly under the Biden administration. So all of these things together kind of create this huge boom for private companies that are trying to make money off of the business of criminalizing migration. And for us, it's been very important to be able to call out some of these companies because, companies like Palantir for a long time just try to become famous just off of working for the CIA or the Department of Defense. But what we start to see is that those same companies that are creating technologies for wars abroad bring those to a militarized border and then start to make them widespread across the US. And so this trend of using data for policing is not just a trend that we're seeing in migration, it's also a trend that we're seeing with local police departments, with other federal agencies, and they're basically creating a much wider surveillance network that impacts everybody.
So thanks for getting us started, Jacinta, with the overview of not only of the work that you've been doing at Mi Gente, you and your colleagues have been doing there, but also of the way in which various tech companies are engaging with policing, not only in the immigration context, but across the board. I want to turn to Nina now. And Nina, let me bring you in by building on Jacinta's sort of sweeping description of the way that various police sources or agencies are relying on intense information gathering and information collating. But I want to get you to help me understand sort of a different perspective, and that is, how do we get from ICE wanting to know about, say, criminal history, and looking at criminal records, to ICE wanting to know about electricity service, ICE wanting to know about internet service, and how do we go from, and how does ICE go from me setting up an account for mundane and very basic features of modern life, like taking out a contract for electricity service or taking out a contract for internet service, to potentially landing on ICE's radar, and then what happens after that?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So this is a really great example to illustrate just how expansive ICE surveillance has become over the years, to the point where when someone signs up for water or electricity, their information could make their way to ICE investigations. So the way that this works is when someone applies for water or electricity, internet, or other utility services, they hand over certain personal information to the companies, like their name, their contact information, and importantly, their home address. So utility companies often use this information for a couple of different purposes. The first one is they will take this and conduct credit checks on somebody. So if you have a new applicant, the company may want to see their history of paying their bills on time. They also use this information to do something called skip tracing, which is essentially to track someone down if they have any overdue payments. So they would want to know their address and their contact info. And the frameworks for allowing these companies to do so rely on mass programs of data sharing that were created several decades ago. So in 1993, a small group of companies, including AT&T, Verizon, they decided to band together and pool their customer data into a shared database. Eventually, over time, they decided to bring in gas, water, electricity companies to contribute their customers' information as well. And their justification was that, quote, because the services provided by utility companies are tied to physical location, they tend to have accurate address information. So this data exchange was intended to facilitate, things like credit scoring and skip tracing. And it became really effective because utility providers could access this data to look up someone's history of paying their bills. And anytime a customer left a company and signed up with another member in the exchange, their address and contact information would enter the database as well. So this group of companies called themselves the National Consumer Telecommunications and Utilities Exchange, or NCTUE for short. They also hired the credit scoring agency Equifax to manage all of this data for them. And in turn, Equifax negotiated the right to package up all this information and deliver it to downstream buyers. So that was all happening in the background. And then fast forward a few years later, in 2010, I signed a $21 million contract with a company called Thomson Reuters, which is an information services company that sort of provides the agency with access to all sorts of different data points through a database called CLEAR. And as Jacinta was mentioning, a lot of this information is processed and analyzed through Palantir's services. But the database itself pulled billions of pieces of data from places like driver's license and vehicle registrations, employment records, as well as their utility bills, which Thomson Reuters said comes from Equifax. So given all the history that we know with Equifax and all that it was doing on the side with credit or utility companies, it's very likely the case that an ICE agent who used CLEAR to look up names and addresses from utility records was pulling up customer data handed over to Equifax by the member utility companies in NCTUE. So Equifax has remained pretty secretive about which utility companies are part of this exchange, but documents indicate that includes national giants like Verizon, AT&T, as well as smaller regional utility companies like Baltimore Gas and Electric. And it's completely possible that the companies themselves have no idea that their customers' information is being shared with ICE. And this is pretty massive in scale. The NCTUE database contains over 400 million records from more than 85 different companies. It represents people from all 50 states and DC. And in total, I believe the NCTUE database claims to hold about 218 million unique customers, which is just about 80% of all American adults.
All right, so Nina, let me just make sure I understood. So what you're saying there is that if I call up the electric utility that services my house or the cable company that provides internet service to my house and ask them whether they are whether that information that they're gathering from me in order to provide the electrical service or the internet service or might end up in the hands of a law enforcement agency like the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, they might not know the actual answer to that question. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. They may not know where their information is ending up down the line, simply because so many different entities are involved. You have the utility companies, you have Equifax, you have Thomson Reuters CLEAR, and then ultimately you have ICE. So because there's such a long chain, where this information gets up is really easily obscured.
All right, so building staying on this theme of the many different directions in which information that is entered into or that is handed over from a private individual to a particular company in exchange for a particular service might somehow sort of blossom in completely unknown directions. Jacinta, let me get back to you with regard to some databases that many of my students are very familiar with, and those are the legal research databases, Lexis and Westlaw. that from the very first day that they start studying law, they start training on how to use those. And after they're long gone from my classrooms, they're out practicing, representing clients in any kind of practicing any kind of law. And more often than not, they're going to be relying on the information that they're gathering, that they're able to access through Lexis, through Westlaw. Talk to me about ICE's relationships with those companies specifically, and the work that Mi Gente has done around this.
Definitely. You know, one, I just want to be super clear to start off that Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis are very clear on what they're doing. I think a lot of times when people sort of hear about this complicated web, they're like, oh, well, maybe if we clarified. No, these companies know that most people know them as research groups or media groups or publishers, but they actually are trying to expand their business into data and are very unapologetic about working with agencies like ICE and the police. So just to kind of start off, to be very clear that these companies know exactly what they're doing, and many times want to make sure that people don't find out, right? Because they want to continue to be able to have this kind of corporate, identity as multiple things, even though this is where they're getting a lot of their profit from. And I want to also be clear that ICE is very clear on what they're doing in terms of getting private sources of data to be able to create, like Nina was just saying, the list of names and list of addresses for when they do raids. So when ICE goes into a community, when ICE decides to do a workplace raid, where they're getting a lot of that information from is from these private data sources. And so both the company knows what they're doing and what they're contributing to, and ICE is very clear that they're doing that. And they're explicitly doing that in many situations, in many circumstances, to get around sanctuary city laws, right? We know that in a lot of states, a lot of cities, there's been local ordinances, state laws that have been passed to limit transfers from prisons and jails to ICE, or to limit information sharing between local authorities or city workers and ICE. And this is for them a way to go around that. And try to get people's information directly to be able to create these target lists, to be able to create these raids. And so, there's a lot of things that we can do here, right? I think one, what we've started to see is that there's a need to be able to create local and state policies to attack this, right? So folks can create local ordinances, folks can actually also work with their states around their Office of Motor Vehicles, right? Utilities are a huge problem, but also private sources of information getting leaked through driver's license databases or insurance databases is also a huge problem. And there's a lot of things that can actually be done to prevent that, and that local community organizations are working really hard on. But then we're also, these kind of problems are so big that they really require an all hands on deck moment. And so it's been really exciting for us to not only be working with, local elected officials and community groups that have been organizing against deportations for a while, but also to be working with law students. There's been, dozens and dozens of law students, of different law schools that have been organizing on their campus to be able to push back against this. And there's also been a lot of librarians who have gotten in on the fight, and this has actually started to lead to a lot of changes. We just recently heard of a library at the Lake Washington Institute of Technology just canceled their contract with LexisNexis because of their contract with ICE. And this is the first time we've heard of someone being able to sort of cancel that contract and take that really strong position. But also, for example, Seattle University Law School, right, is starting to rethink, because of student pressure, because of student organizing, the way that they're forcing students to actually engage with these companies. And let me tell you, the companies hate it. Like I always joke with people, but like Palantir, Thomson Reuters, LexisNexis, they have never reached out to me to talk. But every time there's a student group on a campus organizing around this, they immediately try to reach out, they immediately try to engage, because they know how hurtful it can be to their brand and to their image. And there's a lot of power there. So it's been very exciting for us to be able to work hand in hand with organizers and students and professors on these campuses who have been doing this. And I didn't know about the world of law librarians, but they're fucking amazing. And it's really fun to sort of see just like the diligent, the determination to really sort of get to the bottom of this, because you're saying, many times it's the same company that's helping you investigate case law to figure out how to do deportation defense is the same company that's selling someone's address to ICE. And so those are real contradictions that exist, and there's a lot of work there to be done. But I will just say one last thing, that another place that we've been doing work around has been actually working with investors. So both Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis are publicly traded companies. We've been working with a union in Canada to do a shareholder resolution against Thomson Reuters. And this last year, we're actually able to get 70% of independent shareholders to vote to say that there had to be a human rights impact investigation into the consequences of their contracts with ICE. And so you're also starting to see that it's not just, again, community organizers, it's not just folks that are directly impacted and immigrants, but law students, librarians, and also investors that are starting to figure out how to kind of attack this. And it's a big problem, but I think if we all are able to sort of put in our contribution and fight in our little neck of the woods, that we're actually able to build some power to change the conversation around how data is being used by ICE.
Well, I'll certainly reiterate how awesome law librarians and librarians of all stripes are. I am somebody who is a big fan of librarians. But Jacinta, let me follow up on a comment you made, in part because of a question that came in about the ask of LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters, Westlaw. So is the ask to do as this example you pointed out, Lake Washington Community College, I think it was, that you said, that severed its contract, or is the ask something else to try to use the power, the influence that, say, students have, that librarians have, that faculty have, with those company to request something else, or is really the ask is to say, look, you all are going to do whatever you're going to do, and we don't want any part of it. And I'm asking, I want to sort of add a bit to the question from the student, because I think about it from the perspective of the academic institution that does have an obligation to our students to train them on how to engage in legal research, right? And we're talking about Westlaw and Lexis doing more or less the same thing. There are no good alternatives besides going old school and saying, look, let's teach you how to use the books that are in the law libraries, gathering dust. I don't even know if they're still being updated in paper format. So when it comes to the alternatives, I wish there were a different option out there. But when you're talking about Westlaw and you're talking about Lexis, I mean, you're close to 100% of the legal research marketplace there. And if we don't have contracts with those companies to be able to teach our students how to use those, now I'm not sure what the alternative is.
No, and this is one of the biggest challenges to organizing around this, is precisely as you're explaining, they have a monopoly on this, right? And so given that they have that monopoly, they're trying to keep it, and they're trying to sort of use that power in this way. I think it's a huge challenge, but for me, one, there have been actually a lot of advances in different alternatives. And again, we'll kind of, as a non-lawyer and as a non-librarian, I'm not quite sure how to explain them in detail, but do know that folks have been kind of being able to sort of provide some of those and provide training in those to be able to have other options. But to me, the question is, can we actually create a different conversation? If we just accept it as, well, they're the only option that we have, I guess we just have to go with them, that sort of gives them the green light to sort of feel like that's not going to have any sort of consequence on their business. And at the end of the day, we know that the biggest problem here is the fact that we have ICE, a policing agency that has billions of dollars at their disposal to criminalize and to deport migrants. And that's where we have to focus on, is making sure that we're able to tell all private companies, whether you're a data company, whether you're a private prison company, whether you are a technology company, if you have a contract with ICE, you're actually facilitating those human rights abuses, and there should be business consequences for that. There should be investment consequences, there should be reputational consequences for that. And so that's a place where we have a lot of power, both as we're pushing for federal policy change, right, but also as we're pushing companies to have accountability for the way that they're contributing to these abuses. And so to me, it's really about, can we create a different conversation? Can we create real different pressure? And again, sometimes student organizing, the first year, it's not able to cancel the contract right away. But the fact that that demand even exists actually starts to put pressure on the company to review its policies. And that also has an impact with lawmakers, right? Because they start to see and understand the issue differently. So again, for me, this is why we're all in a movement together, because it's not like local policy is going to solve it, or federal policy is going to solve it, or librarians are going to solve it, or investors are going to solve it. It is actually when we are able to create all of these forces together that we're able to push a different conversation and create power in a different way. And the impacts of that long term are sometimes things that we can't even imagine, but it is because of the organizing that we're doing right now.
Well, and in addition to that, I'd point out that when it comes to Lexis and when it comes to Westlaw, they actually have staff, right, who are assigned to each of these academic institutions and who show up on campus, and oftentimes they have their their little goodies that they give away. They're there, right, and so they are in a position to actually, like, they can't avoid having those conversations with the people in the building, because their employees are actually being sent into the building in a way that, say, is not true of Alex Karp, who's hanging out in running Palantir from his house in New Hampshire or wherever he is.
And when these companies come to campuses, like, again, like when Palantir, when Amazon come to recruit, when Thomson Reuters, when LexisNexis come to sell their products, and they get pushback from students, it sends a ripple effect throughout the entire company. Like, we have seen emails, we have seen the scandalous calls that they have with each other. It actually really does have an impact in terms of how they handle themselves and how they think of their reputation. And if we think about the history of boycotts or different organizing that's happened in campuses against companies like this, it actually does have a huge, it really does force a lot of changes. So if there are students that are interested, they're listening to this, that are interested in participating, please reach out, because happy to connect you to other students, other librarians, to kind of be able to connect on some of the resources around alternatives for this research, but also organizing strategies to bring to your campus.
Right. So let me turn back to you, Nina, and I've been talking with Jacinta about the law students, and the tools that we as legal educators use to help train the current generation of law students that are becoming lawyers. But as a lawyer, I think of surveillance from the lens of privacy and of the government's ability to reach into my private affairs. And that balance between privacy and security is one that is contentious in law, and it's contentious in politics. And it's not at all limited to the immigration context. It comes up over and over again in a wide array of different situations. When it comes to companies like the ones that we've been talking about, mostly we've been talking about companies that I'm willing to bet most of us, if not all of us, share a ton of information with on a daily basis. Amazon, Thomson Reuters, and in particular, I mean, Amazon knows absolutely almost everything about me, right? Feels like sometimes, right? From what I like to eat to what I shopping habits and reading interests. And so given that a lot of these companies, these large tech companies, are companies that not only are they companies that ICE relies on heavily, they're companies that are intimately familiar with me and all of us, most of us, at our election, right? We voluntarily give them information on a daily basis. Let me ask you two related questions. First, have we effectively given up any claims to privacy by voluntarily sharing so much information with these companies? And second, what are the privacy implications of ICE's ability to tap the immense computing powers of companies like this?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that we have certainly not given up any claims to privacy because we share information with these companies. And I think it's important to clarify that some of the most sensitive information that ICE gathers, like someone's address information, this is stuff that people exchange, that people share in exchange for basic services that are essential to life. So things like heat and water and electricity and internet, especially during the pandemic, these things are non-negotiable. So it is somewhat of a unfair characterization to say that these are being voluntarily shared because people have no real choice in whether or not they get utilities for their home. I think another thing is important is that a lot of the information that ICE gets is not directly shared with places like Amazon and Thomson Reuters. Lots of this information is being contributed by institutions that people tend to have trust in. So we all know what Amazon does and what Thomson Reuters does, but we're talking about people's utility companies or their local DMV, especially in states where like lawmakers have said that your data will be safe if you register for a driver's license. So in a lot of ways, ICE is really exploiting the fact that many people have no choice but to give up this information. And it's exploiting the fact that people don't see these institutions as places that will give up their data. They really trust these to keep their information safe. So it's a situation of betrayal and exploitation.
Nina, are there, do you know of any state or local examples of, or even sort of national level legislation in other countries that have been proposed here that would provide greater protections for that information that, as you said, is being shared voluntarily, yes, but is being shared for a specific essential activity? And also, let me push back a little on that. I mean, I as much as I just described, shop from Amazon, I wouldn't describe that as essential, right? I can think of my life operating. I'm old enough to remember before Amazon could provide everything in 2 days. So I like to think that I can also, if necessary, return to a moment in the future in which I could again learn to live without giving Amazon so much information.
Yeah. So for the topic of like essential services, I think what I was referencing was like utility services in particular. So a lot of cases, people who, like undocumented immigrants very commonly, who can't or are cut off from access to a lot of these other services like banking, for example, like those sort of more services that you can live without, they have no choice but to go to their utilities companies and sign up for service in their home. So it's that really essential layer that ICE takes advantage of because they know that people have a really hard time going without it. So the fact that people have no choice is something that ICE actively exploits.
All right, so let me invite people to jot their to type their questions into the Q&A feature. I'll be turning to those in just a few minutes. But before we do that, I want to ask Jacinta to take us to a more recent research project that Mi Gente was involved with. Just a few weeks ago, I guess it is, in late October, Mi Gente partnered with a law firm called Just Futures Law and the activist group called the No Border Wall Coalition for a broad critique of surveillance practices. This is a 25-page report that's titled "The Deadly Digital Border Wall." And in that report, Jacinta, you all identified the back-end surveillance practices that we've been talking about. But you also devoted some attention to the development of physical infrastructure by ICE's border-focused partner, the Customs and Border Protection Agency, which houses, importantly, houses the Border Patrol. So what's the link between the services that, say, Amazon and Palantir provide to ICE and the license plate reading and surveillance towers that are described in this latest report, the Deadly Digital Border Wall?
Yeah, and I just plug that there's going to be a webinar this evening, precisely kind of breaking down some of the results on that, or just some of the findings of that report to just kind of make it accessible for folks. So if you're interested in that, go check out our social media. You can register there for the webinar. You know, what we've been seeing over and over again, and I think it actually kind of comes back to this question that you just asked, Nina. We're seeing that it's not just an issue of privacy. This is an issue around corporate power and police power. And what we're seeing is with the expansion of surveillance, this is a way for police to go around getting warrants, right? This is a way for corporations to amass more data, to have more information, to have unfair advantages that not only impact policing, but impact our democracy, impact the economy, the global economy. And so all of these things are really connected and are important to kind of hold as our framework. But what we've also been seeing is that, this issue around surveillance goes on both sides of the aisle, right? When, Trump came in, was saying, we need a wall, we need to build the wall, we need to keep immigrants out. The response from Democrats was, no, we don't need that kind of wall. We need a digital wall. We need a technology wall. We actually need to make investments in a different place. And what we wanted to make sure to expose, and we work with the No Border Wall Ever Coalition, because these are folks from across the border regions in Texas that have been fighting against this, because these are their communities, right? These are communities that have been there for centuries, that this is their home, and have seen the militarization of the border impact every aspect of their life. And the way that technology is being used to kind of increase that militarization, to increase that control, is actually leading to more violence and more deaths, and continuing to reinforce the idea that if there is this deterrent effort, right, that if you have more surveillance, that if you actually use more criminalization against people, that's going to actually stop migration patterns, when we know that that's not the case. They just actually make people have to take greater risks to get to safety, to be able to get to a place where they can get to the US. And so we wanted to create a report that actually kind of just laid out all of the different components, because I think sometimes we don't quite understand what they mean by the digital wall. And so we wanted to, both from the perspective of communities, explain what the impacts are for folks in the border regions, but also really explain, like, what are the technologies and what are the connections. What we started to also track is that some of the companies, for example, like Palantir, have the same sort of history and some of the same friends, right? Peter Thiel is behind some of these things, right? As companies like Anduril that are creating the towers. And we understand that they're also taking sort of lessons from each other's books around how to get government contracts and how to make money off of these things, that they're sharing to try to actually create experimental technologies. So we wanted to be able to just sort of lay it out in a way that organizers could understand, so that we can also really sort of peel back the curtain so people can understand what the surveillance machinery looks like and the impact that it has on people's lives. Because again, this narrative that technology is just this magical thing that's going to fix everything and that has no racial bias and has no implications on people's safety is false, right? We know that the same sort of trends that come up in other types of policing come when you actually add in the technology. And so we just wanted to make sure that people sort of could see that, understand that, name the companies, so that people also understood who was behind all of these interests, so that we can have a different conversation. Because every year in Congress, they're giving them a bigger and bigger budget to spend on these things. And so as long as border militarization is seen as something that's very lucrative, we're going to have more and more companies trying to propose these magical solutions, these technologies that are not getting to the real causes of migration and are just making it more dangerous and more deadly for both folks that are trying to move across the continent, but also for people who have lived in these areas for their lives and for generations.
There's on the point of Peter Thiel is a new, relatively new book that just came out, a biography of him, in which so he's described as somebody who is very much animated by a desire to wield the fiscal power of government agencies to amass greater wealth, and will go in whatever direction that takes him. He's famous for having been an early investor in companies like Facebook, PayPal, and then these days Palantir. But I want to turn to a couple of questions that have come in from some of the audience members. So first, when it comes to voluntarily sharing information, one person wants to know, when we hand over information to, say, Kroger or grocery store for a rewards program, or a clothing store for their rewards program, this person says the data of what you buy is undoubtedly sold to make up for the loss of profit by providing these discounts and rewards. My question is this data also fed to ICE to greater expand their profile? And the question specifically asks about undocumented immigrants, but I'd expand that to just, does this information end up in ICE's hands to surveil people, whether they have the government's permission to be here or not?
I don't know. I'll take a quick stab at it, and then I'll pass it over to you. I think the bigger problem is we don't know. And there's actually no way for us to tell you 100% if the Kroger special rewards program is going to be the way that they're going to get your address or not. I think for us, one of the principles that has been really important with this is, how do we educate about this? How do we expose this in a way that actually creates, in the words of another organization, power, not paranoia? If we sort of continue to use this conversation around data as a way for people to have to hide all their information, that's not actually going to create a powerful movement that's going to be able to hold people accountable for the way that they're profiting off of their data and having that contribute to more policing. So I think we have to be able to both, the way when I talk to undocumented communities about this is, we need to know what they're doing. So we need to know how to keep our communities safe and how to respond and trying to create laws that will actually be able to protect our communities, right? And that's sort of the way that we want to contribute it. But it does point to a bigger problem of, again, companies having so much data on us that just doesn't impact undocumented people, but impacts all of us. They're not just knowing, they just don't want our address for ICE to go and raid your house. They also want to know your voting patterns to be able to make sure what information you get, right? And so again, all of this connects to a bigger problem about how we talk about democracy, information, the economy, and policing. And we have to have a comprehensive conversation about power, both in the hands of corporations and governments, so that we're able to actually get to the root of some of these programs. Because if not, it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. It's like, okay, I got Kroger. Okay, I got the utilities. I got the DMV. Having this approach is sort of where we're starting to do the research, but it's not going to be sustainable long-term. So we have to have a bigger conversation about how we own our own data and who has the ability to steal it from us and then use it in different ways.
Nina, let me first, if you have anything to add about that, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But I want to also ask you a question about. So I started off the hour by referencing the late 19th century, when we started off, the United States federal government started enacting laws that kept out some people and allowed others into the United States, and that necessitated a sorting mechanism, and with that came an information gathering mechanism. We started collecting data, turning people into data, and then figuring out how to sort that. And photographs were a revolutionary addition to this surveillance infrastructure that developed in the very beginnings of the 20th century and the late 19th century. So that makes me stop and wonder, is what we've been talking about today meaningfully different from those instances in the past when law enforcement agencies of one type or another have embraced new technologies, or is this just another version of that just happens to be faster and capable of storing and sorting through infinitely more data.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are a couple of really important factors that distinguish what ICE is doing now with its current surveillance programs from law enforcement just acquiring new technologies in the past. I think one of those is just the sheer scale of it, just how many people these surveillance programs are capturing. It creates essentially a dragnet where there's very little meaningful distinction between whom ICE does and does not track. And it affects so many people in the United States just in ICE's effort to detain and deport. Another thing is, like Jacinta said, I think ICE, the use of these surveillance programs are really evading public scrutiny. There's so little that is known about this information use, these data gathering programs, that it is just so hard to understand what exactly is even going on. So there's just this veil of secrecy over the whole thing.
So one, let me ask. Thanks so much for that, Nina. Let me ask a question that came in from the audience about pressure points for folks who want to engage in some advocacy over these issues. So shareholder investor advocacy is one option that's been mentioned. Student advocacy is another. What about targeting legislators? Are there specific campaigns and or specific legislators that folks ought to be targeting, or that advocates are already engaging in, that people who are tuning in might become part of? And the question is really, I think, focused on federal legislators, members of Congress, but I'd invite you all to weigh in on state and local legislators if that's an option as well.
I'm taking a deep pause and deep sigh, because it's hard working with Congress is hard, y'all. Getting them to do anything is really, really hard. So I don't know if there is any like specific, targets that we want to sort of reach out to. I will say, like, this issue around surveillance is one that legislators are not hearing a lot about. Again, both Republicans and Democrats are constantly saying this is a great solution. And a lot of these companies have started to invest a lot of money into having lobbyists in the halls of Congress, pushing these technologies as, again, the best solution for everyone, the most efficient way to sort of solve the problem, as they're lining their pockets and just contributing to huge humanitarian crisis. So I would say overall, I think the push has to be in actually getting any federal representative to understand that we actually have to defund DHS, whether it's ICE or Border Patrol, because that's the main source of where this funding is coming from. It's not going to help us if we have less surveillance technology, but more Border Patrol agents, or more ICE agents, but less cloud storage. Like, there is actually a way that we actually have to fight again and have a narrative around making sure that these agencies are defunded. There's a big campaign called Defund Hate that has been doing a lot of work around that, and constantly is putting out materials and strategies for people to participate in that. And again, part of the reason that we created this report was for folks to actually have something that when they went to meet with their congressional representatives, that they could actually have something to show around what these technologies were and what their consequences were, because there's so much education work that has to happen. So, happy to talk more to groups that are doing that work, but I think those are just some of the tools. It's actually targeting funding for the agency as a whole, and then actually being able to kind of provide direct understanding for legislators around why these technologies are so deadly and harmful to communities.
Nina, can I ask you specifically about platforms like Zoom and YouTube? Some of the very common, we're using it right now, features of pandemic life that haven't been mentioned yet. Do you have any information about whether these are also engaging in some of the same practices that we've been talking about?
It's a very interesting question. I think I don't know exactly about Zoom and YouTube. The complicating thing about all this is just it's so hard to know who is sharing information and what it's being used for. The earlier question about the Kroger membership card or like the store credit cards, like I don't know anything specifically about this, but given the fact that so much of the information shared is being funneled through like financial companies or like credit scoring companies like Equifax, I would be inclined to like believe that that stuff is happening. I don't know about Zoom or YouTube. I think it's just so hard to find this information out. And like Jacinta said, that is one of the core issues with this.
Okay, and so I think that we only have a few minutes left, so I want to ask one more question here, and I think this is a wonderful question to end on because I think it really goes to the limits of the critique that you've both been lodging, and the question asks about whether your concern is only about the way that this information is being used in enforcing immigration law or law enforcement generally, as the audience member puts it. Do you think it is the collection and use of the information itself that needs to stop, or what the information is being used for?
That's a hard, tricky question to answer in 2 minutes, but it's just hard. Like, if companies or policing agencies have the information, trust me, they're not going to use it for information that's good unless there's some sort of like check and balance on that power. And so that's where it becomes really, really difficult because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not just concerned about ICE using this information. Local police authorities and different agencies are using this information in a huge way. Like if you look at the boom of, for example, the use of ankle shackles, it's not just expanding with immigration enforcement, it's expanding everywhere, right? And so in a lot of places where they were able to get some level of decarceration under COVID, it led to huge expansions of ankle shackle programs. And so that actually leads to more and more programs. And then these technologies become normalized to such a point where fighting against this new chapter of criminalization and policing becomes harder and harder. And part of the challenge for us as organizers, where we're trying to do away with centuries of systems and institutions that have been built, and then are also trying to sort of foresee where these things are going and how they're being built up in different ways. But to me, as long as you have companies that are like Amazon, more powerful than a lot of governments, right? And no one's able to check that power. Or then you have agencies like ICE that are international spying agencies that actually are not really even accountable to Congress. You're going to have huge issues with human rights, with civil rights, with the ways that we relate to each other in communities. And to me, that's the bigger problem. So I don't know if it's like you handle the information or how it gets used, but like being able to disentangle those when you have so many power amassed in a sort of place without any sort of accountability or transparency, it creates a lot of issues.
Yeah, and just quickly adding on to that, I think oftentimes ICE actually tries to portray the image of the fact that they're only targeting what they consider serious criminals or terrorists or something like that. And without the proper accountability in place, you really would have to take their word that that's all they're doing, which is really hard to do if you don't have any checks and balances on the process. So because these information sharing processes are so obscure and there's so much latitude given to these agencies to scale these programs up, it's important that we have proper accountability measures to make sure that they're not infringing on people's rights.
Well, on that point of oversight, even the internal oversight units within the Department of Homeland Security regularly describe their own limitations in managing to keep an eye out for what's happening within the agencies, or to actually follow up. And partly this is because of resource constraints, partly it's because of design, institutional design features, in which oversight is rather limited. But I want to be cognizant of the time and everyone's need to get on to other things, and especially Jacinta and Nina, who have been so gracious with their time in joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to talk to both of you. And so thank you very much for joining us. For everyone else, this is not the final of the Charlas on Migration that's scheduled for this semester on December 7th. I'll be joined by Ju Jaffe Block and Terry Green Sterling, two journalists who have written a fabulously informative book about Sheriff Joe Arpaio, former Sheriff Joe Arpaio in the Phoenix area, and of the political organizing that developed in that community that ultimately led to his electoral defeat. That'll be on December 7th, and I shared the registration information page through the chat feature earlier. So thank you so much, Jacinta. Thank you very much, Nina, for joining us, and thanks to all the rest of you for being here with us this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.